This is BBC World News. I'm Geetha Goramuthi. Our top stories. Ukraine's President Zelensky calls on the West to avoid creating panic in the face of a Russian troop build-up on the border.
The biggest risk is to fail to hold the country together. This is the domestic destabilization inside the country. This is the weakest link.
Presidents Putin of Russia and Macron of France agree on the need for de-escalation over the crisis in Ukraine, but fears remain over a Russian invasion. The World Food Programme says more than 80% of people in the Ethiopian region of Tigray are going hungry. Fresh doubts emerge over the timeline of the COVID test that Novak Djokovic reported during his ill-fated attempt to enter Australia. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. Ukraine's President Zelensky has called on the West to avoid creating panic in the face of a Russian troop build-up on the border. It comes as the French and Russian presidents spoke by phone and agreed on the need for de-escalation of the crisis in Ukraine. As concerns of an invasion increase amongst Western leaders, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that Moscow doesn't want war with Ukraine. Let's get the very latest from our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, live in Kiev. Lise.
Well, the crisis over Ukraine is at the top of the agenda for many world leaders, and telephone lines are burning between so many capitals. That crucial telephone call yesterday between President Joe Biden and President Zelensky of Ukraine. This morning it was the French President Emmanuel Macron speaking for more than an hour on his telephone conversation with Vladimir Putin. All of this coming in the midst of increasing concern over Russia troop movements along the border with Ukraine. The Pentagon saying that in the last 24 hours, they've seen increased activity. From so many corners of the world, we're hearing conflicting accounts of whether or not this war of words will escalate into another invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It was the turn of President Zelensky here in Kiev today to voice his concerns. And at the top of his mind was the worry that all this worry about escalation could itself fuel the escalation. Let's hear a bit of what he had to say.
This is the proxy threat, or threats in plural, threats to Ukraine and other countries, also in plural. We are not the only neighbor to the Russian Federation. We are not the only neighbor to the temporarily occupied territories. So with a full-scale war, there won't be just a war with Ukraine or against Ukraine or just in the territory of our state. This is going to be a proxy war, infops, cyber ops. We are trying to protect our sites, but we can understand where it is launched from, the Russian Federation, other destinations, so to speak. Now, if we discuss war with the result of firing, this is one kind of war. This is the 20th century war.
President Zelensky, well, the message from Moscow again today was we do not want a war in Ukraine and we are not planning any invasion. That was the top line coming out of Sergei Lavrov, who spoke to Russian media the day after Russia had received the responses by President Biden to the demands set out by President Putin last month. President Sergei Lavrov gave conflicting signals indicating that there were, in his words, some grains of rationality in the U.S. response, but he also criticized Washington for muddying the waters. Let's hear a bit of what he had to say.
If it depends on Russia, there will be no war.
but we will not let them undermine and ignore Russian interests. I cannot say for sure if negotiations are over now. As you know, the US and NATO have been studying our simple proposals for more than a month. And only the day before yesterday, we received answers in Western style that are a bit confusing but rational in minor issues. This is better than nothing, but the main thing for us is to deal with the basic concepts of European security.
Well, these remarks by Sergei Lavrov are being seen as the strongest signal yet that Moscow is willing to engage with the United States over finding a negotiated way out of this crisis. Our Moscow correspondent Caroline Davies has this assessment.
Well, we know it was lengthy to start with, which I suppose is a relatively good sign. But we also know some of the elements that were talked about according to a readout from that call from Moscow. So some of the points that were made, the Russian side have said that they would carefully study the written responses. We know that already. We know that President Putin has got those written responses from America and is saying that they are looking at them. But there's a few other points that I think it's worth pulling out as well. They talked about the fact that the fundamental concerns of Russia preventing NATO expansion, that was not directly addressed, that was not taken into account. We know that that was something that Russia has demanded back in December when they presented these draft treaties to NATO and to America. One of the key demands was that NATO would not expand further eastwards, that in particular Ukraine would not be allowed to join NATO, and that they are, and President Putin has highlighted again, that wasn't addressed by the Americans in their response. And then there's this other paragraph as well saying this key question was ignored, which in summary, the key question is that for Russia, they say this is about the security situation for Russia. They view NATO as being an aggressive force, and therefore any form of its expansion, they are arguing, is an issue for their own security.
Caroline Davies in Moscow. One of the main messages that came out of President Zelensky's comments to the press today was that this crisis is nothing new. It's no different now, he said, than the way it was last month. We have been dealing with this crisis, he said, for the last 8 years. Well, let's bring in someone who's seen the crisis over many years. General Philip Breedlove was the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. He's now the distinguished chair at the Middle East Institute, an initiative called the Frontier Europe. He joins us now. General Breedlove, welcome to BBC.
Good morning. It's good to be back with you.
Does it seem to sound very similar? You, of course, were the NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during the crisis over Crimea, and also what happened still happens in eastern Ukraine. Is this any different?
Well, let's say it another way. I think there are a lot of similarities. And before I even start, let's be happy and applaud the fact that there is still dialogue, and maybe there is a chance for diplomacy here. But to get back to your question, this is a completely contrived, completely manufactured crisis by Mr. Putin in Russia in order to pressure the West to accede to their demands, to capitulate and address the Russian demands. So I had to giggle a moment there when we talked about how warlike the NATO is. We don't have over 100,000 troops sitting on Russia's borders.
You've been critical of NATO, if I can describe it as that, saying the fact that President Putin keeps doing this is because he sees the weakness of the Western military alliance, that they don't have an answer to his playbook, so he keeps playing by it.
Okay, I don't think I've used those words. What I have said is that if we look back to 2008 and we look at the West's, which means the US, NATO, and even the EU and others, if we look back to 2008, do we believe that we had an adequate response to Russia invading Georgia and occupying South Ossetia and Abkhazia? We look back to 2013 and 14 when Russia invaded and occupied Crimea, and then invaded and occupied Donbass, and they remain in both at this point. Did the West, did NATO, did we respond appropriately to that? I think that the lessons that we fail to learn is that if we allow bad behavior to stand, or worse, if we reward bad behavior, then we're going to get more bad behavior. And here we are in 2022 with another force sitting on the border of Ukraine. So I would like to say that that's the remarks I've been making.
Well, in a sense, what you are saying is they didn't respond forcefully enough in 2008 in Georgia. It happened. It's still there. They didn't do, there was a lot of words, but not much action with the annexation of Crimea, what happened in Donbass. So what has to happen this time so it doesn't happen again?
Well, I think that we need to examine the toolbox that we're using. Typically, when we deal with Russia over issues like this, it's sanctions, more sanctions, deeper sanctions, wider sanctions, special sanctions, extra special sanctions. Our nations have more tools in their kit than sanctions. We have diplomatic tools, which I believe we're beginning to bring to the front now in this crisis. We have informational tools. We have never answered Russia's disinformation campaign. We in the West are not organized to do that at threat speed. And we have military tools, which we have eschewed in the past with the mantra being, we can't provoke Russia. So what we do typically with Russia is rely on sanctions. And my question back to you and others are, have our sanctions really changed Mr. Putin's actions? And I think the answer is no. Here we are again with another manufactured crisis going on.
But President Biden, not surprisingly, has made it clear he does not plan to fight the war in Ukraine with American troops. That's very much the signature of the Biden administration. NATO does not really want to get drawn in, aside from helping some of the frontline states. Are you saying they should be putting their boots on the ground and fighting this war?
No, in fact, I follow along the same lines. But here's what we could be doing. If you looked at the two documents that Russia handed us originally and said, here is what we demand, accept it, or we're going to proceed to other measures. And in those documents, a couple of things that they're most worried about are additional forces, additional weapons and capabilities in the forward area. So NATO is already beginning to address that. Several nations have sent aircraft, several nations have sent ships. The United States has alerted its component of the NRF and the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force. Others are talking about movements. And so we answer by giving Mr. Putin exactly what he didn't want. And the message then is, if you continue this bellicose nature, then you will get the result that you were trying to avoid. And maybe then we can convince him to negotiate and to discuss in good terms.
General Breedlove, it sounds as though you're still spending a lot of time thinking through the options, like so many around the world are. Thank you very much for sharing some of your assessments with us. General Breedlove, a former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe for NATO. There you get a sense here in our coverage on BBC World, the intensity of the crisis over Ukraine, the intensifying diplomacy and the concern about what's happening on the ground. How long can Russia keep more than 100,000 troops and heavy equipment massed along the border with Ukraine without doing something one way or the other? But what he will do, and if he will do it, President Biden talked about a distinct possibility that would happen, is now the issue that's occupying the minds of so many world leaders, and most of all the minds of Ukrainians who, as we heard so forcefully from the president today, this is not a new crisis for them. They've been living with it for a long time. They just want to know when and how it's going to end. We're going to continue our special coverage of the Ukrainian crisis here from Kiev. Back to you in London.
Lise Doucette for now. Thank you very much indeed. Doubts have emerged over the timing of the positive COVID test Novak Djokovic used to enter Australia to try to compete in the Australian Open. It was submitted to exempt him from rules barring unvaccinated people. The tennis star said he had a positive test on December the 16th with a negative one 6 days later. But the unique confirmation codes on the test suggest the positive result may have come after the negative one. Mr. Djokovic has been approached for comment but hasn't responded. Our correspondent Matt Groveling has more on the BBC's investigation.
This was Novak Djokovic's chance to win his 10th Australian Open and with it the most Grand Slams ever achieved in men's tennis. Upon arrival in Melbourne on the 5th of January and confirming he was unvaccinated, his visa was revoked by the government. The Serbian was given an exemption to play having tested positive for coronavirus in mid-December. In an attempt to overturn the decision, Djokovic's legal team presented 2 COVID test certificates to a federal court in Australia. The first, shown to be taken on the 16th of December, shows a positive result. The second, taken 6 days later, shows a negative result. A German research company questioned why the unique confirmation code on the earlier test was higher than the later one. The BBC has investigated if codes on tests done in Serbia are generated in a chronological order. A total of 56 test certificates were collected and their unique confirmation codes plotted against the date of each result. In all cases studied, the earlier the result, the lower the unique code for the corresponding test. The only outlier of the codes plotted was Novak Djokovic's positive test on the 16th of December. According to the BBC's graph, this confirmation code would suggest a test sometime between the 25th and 28th of December. One data specialist said, "There is always the possibility for a glitch, but if this was the case, I don't know why the authorities would not say that." To try and explain this discrepancy, the BBC has approached Novak Djokovic's team, Serbia's Institute of Public Health, and its Office of Information Technology, but has yet to have a response. Matt Graveling, BBC News.
Do stay with us here on BBC World News. Still to come, we'll be speaking to the World Food Programme as it warns the overwhelming majority of people are now going hungry in the troubled Tigray region of northern Ethiopia.
The story of the United States has been written for centuries. Penned by millions of authors, written in every language, from every perspective. With every chapter as unique as our people and our land. Our story is one made up of many. Find yours in the USA.
We start at Wimbledon.
Stand by for a moment of history.
The headlines keep breaking.
The Winter Olympics.
Now to cricket.
The Tour de France.
The Africa Cup of Nations.
The debate keeps raging.
They're still the team to beat.
England's batting is weak.
It's going quite well.
Definitely a lot of disappointment.
The results keep coming.
What was going through your mind?
It was absolutely amazing.
My heart rate was up.
It's part of the game.
This is a really tasty tie.
It's one of a kind.
This is Sport Today.
For all the latest results, headlines and analysis, Sport Today on BBC World News.
This is BBC World News, the latest headlines. Russia's President Putin tells his French counterpart that the West has ignored Moscow's security concerns as tensions ratchet up over its military build-up on the border with Ukraine. Fresh doubts have emerged over the timeline of the COVID test that Novak Djokovic reported during his ill-fated attempt to enter Australia. The United Nations World Food Programme says more than 80% of people in the Ethiopian region of Tigray have not got enough to eat. It says no UN food convoy has reached the area since mid-December and 100 trucks a day are needed to prevent starvation. Well, government forces have been fighting Tigrayan rebels in northern Ethiopia for more than a year. It's appealed to the warring parties to allow aid in. Thompson Ferry is a spokesperson for the World Food Programme in Geneva. Thanks very much for joining us. Just how worried are you about the situation there and the people there?
We are extremely worried. We are concerned about civilians in Tigray. I guess this is what 15 months of war buys you. Food security in Tigray has plummeted since the start of this crisis. Now you're talking of about 2 million people of the Tigrayan population severely food insecure.
And in terms of how much help is needed immediately, that's figure of 100 trucks a day, is that possible logistically quickly?
Logistically, we can do it. We can deliver. We are able to push the boundaries of humanitarian response. But we have a very, very difficult situation in Tigray. We lack fuel. We lack funding, and there continues to be active conflict. In that situation, it is very difficult to deploy the humanitarian supplies or even aid workers to be able to rescue the situation.
Who can unlock this then?
We need guarantees from all parties to the conflict of safe and secure humanitarian pause and formally agreed transport corridors into Tigray region immediately, so that we are able to supply and reach millions of people who are in need of life-saving assistance at scale. We need support from politicians, the federal authorities, as well as the regional authorities in Ethiopia.
If that doesn't happen, what will be the outcome for all those people now on the brink, really?
The situation is quite dire. It will worsen. We fear that people will fall deeper into crisis unless the conflict stops now, unless we are able to scale up, unless we receive those guarantees that I was talking about earlier on, unless humanitarian workers are able to move in and out of the areas with ease, as well as to mount an effective response. I'm afraid the West is yet to come.
It's one thing, isn't it, to understand this in terms of huge numbers. Can you give us an idea of, individuals and how they are being affected? We've seen, babies, children, pregnant women, all being affected by this.
The numbers are quite stark. You're talking of about 2 million people in Tigray alone. Almost the entire population of Tigray needs help. Approximately 83% of the population, which is about 4.6 million people, are food insecure and they're struggling to find enough food to eat. The situation is even worse when you look at malnutrition rates. You have over 13% of children under the age of 5. Half the women who are pregnant and nursing who were found to be malnourished in Tigray. In neighboring regions of Amara, the situation is no better. You have more than 14%. And in Afar, you have up to 28% of children under the age of 5. And that is way, way above the emergency threshold of 15% who are all malnourished. The situation is quite bad. Speaking to people there on the ground, people have not been able to harvest. People do not know where their food is coming from. Some people who didn't need assistance in the past are having to rely on assistance today because they have no other means. They have no one to tend to. And in the period that we are looking at, in November when we did this study, we realized actually that WFP's food assistance was the difference for most of these people.
Thompson Ferry from the World Food Programme, thank you very much indeed. More than 70 people are now known to have died as a result of Tropical Storm Anna, which swept across southern Africa earlier this week. People in Malawi, seen here, and Madagascar and Mozambique were worst affected. But there's also been damage in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Hundreds of thousands of people have been left homeless, and there are concerns that another storm could hit the region in the next week. Here in the UK, the controversy surrounding alleged gatherings in Downing Street, Boris Johnson's home when COVID restrictions were in place, continues. The civil servant Sue Gray's report was due to be published today or yesterday, but now the police revealed that they've asked her to make minimal reference to events which they are actually investigating. Many British MPs say they are waiting for the Gray report before taking a position on Boris Johnson's future as Prime Minister. Nick Eardley reports.
Getting answers around here isn't always straightforward. What went on in Downing Street and were COVID rules broken? This woman, Sue Gray, had been expected to deliver her report this week, but now it's unclear what happens next after the Metropolitan Police launched its own investigation and told Ms Gray to limit what she published. In a statement this morning, the force said, "For the events the Met is investigating, we asked for minimal reference to be made in the Cabinet Office report." They added that was to avoid any prejudice to our investigation.
What I want to see is Sue Gray's report in full and the investigation finished as quickly as possible, because we're in this situation where the whole of government is paralysed because the police are now looking at what the Prime Minister was getting up to in Downing Street.
Downing Street says they aren't involved, but the Liberal Democrat leader has suggested there's been a stitch-up which could damage politics for generations. Sue Gray and her team had been speaking with the Met to try and figure out what could and couldn't be put in the public domain. But that process has now been thrown into chaos. The Cabinet Office was caught by surprise by this morning's statement, and now it's not totally clear what can be published and when that might happen.
I think the Sue Gray report is independent. The government aren't interfering with it, which is exactly as it should be. And I am completely confident that between the Sue Gray report and the police investigation, everything will be covered. It is important that we move on and draw a line under this, because there are very important things the government is working on.
The political pressure, though, continues. Boris Johnson's predecessor has added her voice, saying in a letter that nobody is above the law and that she was angry to hear stories about people in Number 10 not properly following the rules. The government wants to move on, but this row has dominated at Westminster for weeks. After this morning's developments, it's not clear when we'll get answers and what it will mean for Boris Johnson and his government. Nick Earley, BBC News, Westminster.
Of course, everything is being updated online. I'm on Twitter and I'm back with the headlines and another full roundup in about 30 minutes. Thanks very much for joining us. This is BBC World News. Bye for now.